It's time for Top Story on AM 1480 WLEA Hornell. Here's Ryan O'Neill.
Well, this week in the news, we had the school votes pretty much across the board. Locally, the school budgets passed. In Hornell now, there was a problem with the voting machine, so they declared the vote on Prop 2 null and void. Prop 2 was the vote on whether to increase the number of school board members from 5 school board members to 7. So they didn't count that. The school district clerk, Carol Eaton, says they may revisit that vote at a later date. Also in local news this week, St. James held another community town hall meeting. A couple of things came out of that meeting. We learned that St. James is selling Macaulay Manor and that St. James is eventually going to shut down the respiratory unit. Earlier in the week, and this was on actually last week, Saturday, Rob Astorino stopped by Angelica over in Allegheny County on Saturday afternoon. He and his lieutenant governor candidate, Chemung County Sheriff Christopher Moss, visited a gun place in a shooting club in Angelica. In other news, Larry Hot Dog Stevens continues his newspaper political ad campaign against Hornellsville Town Supervisor Ken Eisman and some fireworks at the Hornell Common Council meeting on Monday night. In segment 1 today, Hornell Republican Alderman John Buckley, and in segment 2, Hornell native Dr. Jim Tracy, a professor down south. He's going to talk about a law that Congress wants to pass that would apparently tie hate crimes to articles written online and talk radio. Now welcoming Hornell Alderman John Buckley here in segment 1. John, thanks for coming on.
Good morning, Brian. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for coming on, John. John, wanted to cover a couple of national and state issues before we do local. The state Dems came out with a video called Send a Message to Washington, in which they refer to some gun legislation and many other issues. Here's a little audio from that video. It lasts 7 minutes. We'll only play about 30 seconds.
Ultra-conservative Republicans have taken control of their party, and they want to use this election to push New York away from our core values. They are vehemently anti-choice, and they even vetoed legislation to stop harassment at health clinics. They oppose banning assault weapons in our communities and are against preventing people with mental health issues from buying guns. They oppose marriage equality. They oppose the DREAM Act. Their nominee for governor has called a woman's right to choose ghastly. He's told seniors who can't afford dentures to just eat soup. He's the only county executive in the nation in violation of federal civil rights laws.
Those horrible, evil Republicans, wanting to protect the unborn child, wanting to protect the Second Amendment, saying no to illegal immigrants, getting on the dole. It's really unbelievable. Only in the bizarro world of liberal New York State politics would you have an ad or a campaign like that.
Another video that was released this week was from Rob Astorino. It addressed the racism charges against Astorino. This is not Astorino himself. I didn't know who the woman was on the video. She was a senior citizen who said that Governor Cuomo should not be using race issues against Rob Astorino because, in her words, Astorino is not guilty of that.
Shame on you, Andrew Cuomo. Accusing Rob Astorino of discrimination is unforgivable. You obviously don't know what racism is, so don't disrespect those of us who do. Rob Astorino opposes that scheme you backed to hand local zoning decisions over to Washington. That crazy plan would lower our home values, raise our taxes, and overcrowd our schools. That's why the most respected community leaders oppose it too. Mr. Cuomo, your use of the race card disgusts me.
Well, the reason Governor Cuomo is using the race card is because it's proven effective. You see it all over the country. It's used time and time again against Republicans. And, all you have to do is claim someone is a racist, and the media picks it up, and they run with it. And, it doesn't matter if it's true or not. people hear that, and then, the damage has already been done. So, that's why he's doing it. Now, by all accounts, Rob Astorino, he's very popular in Westchester County. I mean, it's a Democratic county, and he's a Republican, and he's won that seat a couple of times. So, once again, baseless charges from Andrew Cuomo, but, that's to be expected, and expect more to come.
John, in your rounds of traveling around with and for the GOP, you've met with names like Donald Trump and Sarah Palin. This is Sean Hannity speaking with Sarah Palin on the Hannity Show on Fox TV this week about the so-called Republican war on women. He's talking here about Sandra Fluck feeling entitled to taxpayer-paid-for birth control at Georgetown University.
That somehow she thinks that the public ought to pay for her birth control. I have a hard time understanding that mindset. Can you help me out?
Well, of course you do, because you're a common-sense conservative who just wants fairness in this game now that's being played in the arena of politics. And that game is the left will grasp anything that you say that can be taken out of context and perceived as either being a racist or sexist, and they charge you with that, and that way the conversation is stopped.
John Buckley, the war on women, when you break it down, is the GOP not wanting voters to pay for things like birth control and abortion? Now, this campaign, though, the war on women, it seems to work with voters on the Democratic side. They seem to agree with the sentiment that birth control and abortion should be taxpayer funded. Now, question, with the victories this week for the establishment Republicans who lean more left, how can the Tea Party turn that sort of thinking around? Is it possible?
Well, first of all, let me address you're referring to the primaries this past week, which the establishment Republicans, or so-called establishment Republicans, basically swept the Tea Party candidates. I would submit that, since the Tea Party really got going, a few years back, they've really moved the Republican Party, back to the right. I think the Republican Party was, there was a lot of so-called moderates, or, I don't know, call them what you want, rhinos, that were, drifting to the middle and even, over to the left to some extent. And I think the Tea Party has been effective at pulling the Republican Party back to its core values, whether it be, from a fiscal standpoint, which is, pretty much why they started to begin with, but even, with some of the social issues, abortion. We hear the war on women, the so-called war on women, with abortion. Well, that's a pro-life argument there, but it's really about children. When you say war on women, it's really, the left has a war against the unborn, and that's the narrative that isn't being talked about.
Moving on now to Hornell issues. John, you're now the deputy mayor of Hornell. Tell us about that.
Yeah, how about that? 4 years ago, who would ever thought that I'd be deputy mayor? Who would ever thought that Mayor Hogan would appoint me? It's well documented, the rough waters that the mayor and I navigated in those first few years. We've had our disagreements play out on the airwaves of WLEA on the front page of the Evening Tribune, more times than you can shake a stick at. But, through it all, the mayor and I really, we put all the political differences aside. We can disagree all day long on state and federal politics, but, to our credit, we've been able to put that aside and work to the betterment of our community. Because, really, what's going on in Washington, what's going on in Albany, whether it's the SAFE Act debate or the abortion debate or the war on terror, that really doesn't come into play at the local level. And the two of us were able to, recognize that. And honestly, when you walk through those doors and go to a common council meeting, when I look at my fellow aldermen, I don't look at them as Republicans or Democrats. I look at them as community members who want to give back to their community and do the right thing and work hard to do that. So, we've got a good team down there. It sounds generic. Oh, we've got a good team down there. We really do. This council is, it's changed over quite a bit since I was first elected. A lot of people have retired or stepped down or been defeated. And so we've got a lot of new faces, a lot of fresh faces, new ideas. There's a lot of enthusiasm, which I didn't see before that I'm seeing now. So that bodes well. And for the mayor, for the Democratic mayor, who's the Democratic chairman of the county, to appoint a Republican, and I'm the city chairman. I mean, that says something. So, that's bipartisanship, and I hope that the folks in Albany and Washington can learn a thing or two about what's going on right here in Hornell.
Now, at Monday night's meeting that was voted on, that you became the deputy mayor and you were sworn in, but the bigger news that night, no insult against you intended, was that Hugh and Fraser, local real estate developer, stopped by the council to voice his concerns about a newsletter sent out by Hornell's 6th Ward Alderman Dan McManus. Some fireworks there. Hugh and Fraser seemed very taken back that the newsletter sent out by Dan McManus referred to the tenants of the Prindle Avenue apartments as riffraff.
Yeah, it's unfortunate and really unbelievable that you'd have an alderman referring to people in his ward, his constituency as riffraff. I just don't know what he was thinking doing that. I mean, he put it in writing, put it in this newsletter. And this newsletter, by the way, I don't really consider it a newsletter. I consider it, more of an opinion piece or him spouting off. I'll give Mr. Fraser all the credit in the world. He came in and he fixed up that apartment. It looks beautiful. If you drive by the Prindle Avenue, it's basically 2 buildings. He's going to do the same to the second one. The building that's finished is full. It's got every apartment is occupied, and he's got business professionals here. He's got McManus refers to riffraff, but he's got a Cornell professor, an awesome employee, a couple of people that work in telecom. I think there was another one that's a healthcare professional, and Mr. Fraser did his homework. He talked to the folks and got an idea of their salaries, and the median income of the tenants that live in that building are $55,000. So, to come out and whether he was using the word riffraff aimed at them or anyone else, I find that highly offensive and highly unacceptable. Mr. Fraser, he's investing in our city. He's a resident in our city in the 6th Ward. So could you imagine being this guy and getting this newsletter stuck in your door and reading that? And McManus says, and I'm quoting from his newsletter, it sure would have been a great parking lot and a small green space with a couple of park benches. But I'm just a new guy. What do I know? Well, I'll tell you what I know. We don't need more green space in Hornell. We've got a beautiful park at James Street Park on one end of the city, and we've got another beautiful park down at Shawmut on the other end of the city. We've got enough parks. We've got enough green spaces. And by the way, every school in the city has its own playground. So there's enough green spaces and parks and recreation in the city. We don't need another lawn to mow with a couple park benches plopped down in the middle of it.
And Alderman McManus is welcome to come on this show anytime next week or afterwards if he wants to respond to anything that was said here. Alderman Buckley, any final thoughts before we go?
Yeah, I just want to talk about the Lincoln School real quick. I've got the Lincoln School in my ward, and Edgemere Development is interested in turning that into apartments for seniors. Could you imagine myself coming out and saying, no, we don't want you, stay away, let's knock it down and put a green space. I just don't understand it because, if Hornell, we face a lot of struggles just as other municipalities and, towns, cities, and villages do throughout New York State. And a lot of that is because of what happens in Albany. A lot of it is because no fault of our own. So when you have a Hugh and Fraser or a developer or someone that wants to invest in your community, you should embrace them, not insult them, not drive them away. Because let's face it, that building is assessed a certain amount and he pays taxes on that. So he's contributing to our society. We've got business professionals that live there who have, are stakeholders in the city who buy their goods here, buy their food here, get gasoline here. So, that everything is interconnected, and we should just embrace those people that want to come here.
Alderman Buckley, thanks very much for joining us this weekend.
Always glad to be here, Brian.
Coming up next, Professor Jim Tracy, Dr. Jim Tracy. Back on the show, I'm Brian O'Neill, on the phone now with Hornell native Dr. James Tracy, who's a communications professor down in Florida. Dr. Tracy, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Tracy, you wrote an article recently online. It's about a bill in the House that's being pushed by Massachusetts Democrat Congressman Edward Markey. And the bill is called the Hate Crimes Reporting Act of 2014. The legislation says right in the top paragraph that it seeks to, quote, require the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to update a report on the role of telecommunications, including the Internet, in the commission of hate crimes. Dr. Tracy, can you translate that for us?
Well, yeah, they're going to attempt to go out and determine, classify what speech may somehow elicit a violent act. It's not unlike the concept of pre-crime. But once you go ahead and set that precedent, how could one define what hate speech actually is? And that's the sort of dangerous precipice that we're at with legislation such as this. Now, we don't know whether or not it's something that will actually see passage, but the idea that it is just being considered is very concerning.
Dr. Tracy, this seems to take us back to the times when President Bill Clinton blamed Rush Limbaugh for inspiring Timothy McVeigh for the Oklahoma City bombing. Here's what President Clinton said about that in 1995.
We hear so many loud and angry voices in America today whose sole goal seems to be to try to keep some people as paranoid as possible and the rest of us all torn up and upset with each other. They spread hate. They leave the impression that, by their very words, that violence is acceptable. You ought to see, I'm sure you are now seeing the reports of some things that are regularly said over the airwaves in America today. It is time we all stood up and spoke against that kind of reckless speech and behavior.
Dr. Tracy, your take on what Clinton said there in 1995.
Well, we could probably do a whole show just on that and Oklahoma City, but I would contend that it is to a large degree political opportunism, and we saw a very similar sort of discourse following the Sandy Hook Elementary massacre, following the Tucson, Arizona massacre shooting with Jared Loughner, where you have principally the left and their media and their political leaders come out and say, well, we've got to, it's largely due to the speech of certain individuals in prominent positions, and we've got to curtail this. And it makes them look good to their base and to their supporters, so why not do that? I'm not necessarily blaming them, but I think to a large degree it's grandstanding. And with that particular event with Oklahoma City, we know now that it was much more complex than meets the eye.
Here's what Rush Limbaugh said about Clinton's statements. This is the Rush Limbaugh show in 2010.
He still hasn't produced. I said, Mr. President, give me the words that inspired McVeigh to blow up the building. Nobody can give me the words because McVeigh's own words were that it was a bunch of things culminated by Waco that made him act, not anybody's words. But Clinton is still trying to drum up all this blame for us, Tea Parties and so forth, for something that hasn't happened again. It isn't funny.
You know, this happens every time there's a shooting-type tragedy or a bombing-type tragedy. You see that people like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, who are both on our station, end up getting blamed for it. Dr. Tracy, your take on what Limbaugh said there.
Well, commentators such as Limbaugh or Hannity or others, there's the realization by the Democratic Party and the establishment left that they are effective in mobilizing their base in terms of passage of legislation, in terms of getting people elected, and so they're going to take every opportunity they can to denigrate them, to make them look bad. And I think that's just politics.
Back to Congressman Edward Markey's legislation. Markey says the National Telecommunications and Information Administration should analyze information on the use of telecommunications, including the internet, television, and radio, even public access television, commercial mobile services, and other electronic media to, quote, advocate and encourage violent acts and the commission crimes of hate as described in the Hate Crime Statistic Act. A lot of words there, Dr. Tracy. Can you break that down for us? What's that mean?
Well, again, we have to be careful with regard to what definitions are, and the extent to which politicians are going to attach speech to acts. It could be in a very clumsy fashion, as, for example, Bill Clinton did back in the mid-1990s. And, again, once you set that precedent for classifying speech that some people deem to be, quote-unquote, hateful, then you've reached some dangerous territory that really does, I think, tread on the First Amendment. Now, Markey and others, they say that they're going to be sensitive to the First Amendment, freedom of speech and the like, but the First Amendment is very unambiguous in terms of stating that Congress shall make no law. Congress shall make no law abridging the right to assemble, free speech, religion, and what have you. So I think that this is something that will be very precarious in terms of the First Amendment.
Dr. Tracy, do you see, if this got passed, would this be something that, you talked about pre-crime, would this be something where they hear something on the radio and say, oh, you can't say that because that'll inspire a crime? Or do you read this legislation as saying after a crime is over, we're going to go back and analyze it and dig through and see what shows this guy listened to and see what movies he watched and see – how do you read that legislation?
Well, it could potentially be both. But if there is a particular violent incident, then the individual who is the culprit, all of their communications will be assessed, and then there will be, potential blame. And you could also see individuals. So, for example, a radio personality or a publication that the individual apparently subscribed to face charges. So, again, that's very dangerous. But that could conceivably take place under this type of law.
We're talking with Hornell Native and Communications Professor Dr. Jim Tracy. Dr. Tracy, connected somewhat to this topic is the net neutrality issue. Net neutrality is the rule that anyone who uses the Internet could be able to access any content on the web that they want and use any applications they choose without restrictions. What does that mean for the average person with net neutrality pretty much being gone now?
Well, I think this is something where it's something that has been in the works for the past, 8 years or longer among large entities, the telecommunication companies, that do not like the anarchy of the Internet. They want for it to be streamlined. So they want for really kind of the televisation of the Internet, because it's difficult to sell advertising when you have, millions of websites, and the freedom of people to actually, log on to and type in URL of a particular website and read that blog or listen to their media or watch their media. That's if you're an advertiser, if you're involved in that regard, then it makes it very difficult. So this is something that has been, again, it's been considered, and it's an agenda of, fairly few and powerful players that would like to see a conversion of the Internet along these lines. And, the FCC's abandonment of net neutrality now means that at one time, what I refer to as kind of the golden age of the Internet between the late 1990s and around, up until the present, really, you could get a blog, and you might only have 5 or 10 visitors a day, but that blog, it downloads just as quickly as ESPN.com or a number of websites. For example, let's say at Viacom or Fox News or what have you, and this would be out the window because these large players can afford to pay for that bandwidth, and that's something that is also precedent setting. So it's unfortunate, and it's something that I would think would be challenged. But there are also fairly powerful companies that would like to see the internet remain free, and they will, I think, be active in attempting to defend net neutrality or to reassert it. So you've got fairly powerful entities that are contesting this, the demise of net neutrality.
Final question for Dr. Jim Tracy. You're an observer of culture and media. You're a college professor. You deal with students all the time. There was a new video out. It was a survey done of college students, and it turned out that the students know more about the singer Pharrell than they did Benghazi. Your thoughts on that video?
Well, it's not surprising. I think it's probably fairly consistent with my experience. And most young people are generally depoliticized. They're generally turned off to politics, and there's a variety of reasons for that. I think that perhaps 30 or 40 years ago that was not as much the case because of the nature of communication, of mass communication then. You had 3 networks. You got maybe a couple of newspapers a day, and so you had an idea of what the country's agenda was, what important things were at the federal level, state level, and so forth. And now our attention is so refracted. It is so, it in many ways is, decentralized, and there are 1,000,001 stimuli. And young people today have grown up with the Internet, and they've grown up with multitasking. And so I could see how there are these increased kind of socio-cultural obstacles to people actually focusing on things that are important. And something like Benghazi is very important.
Dr. Jim Tracy, thanks for joining us this weekend.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Always great having you on. Also, our thanks to Hornell Republican leader John Buckley for being on in segment 1. I'm Brian O'Neill. InfoTrack is next on AM 1480 WLEA Hornet, 1480 WLEA Hornet, 1480 WLEA Hornet, 1480 WLEA.